This is the last video in the section of solving quadratic equations. If you notice, I don't actually have an equation on the board, I have a word problem. So that's what we're going to focus our time in on this particular video, is solving word problems using quadratic equations, quadratic formulas, factoring, all that good stuff. A couple things I need to know. One is there's, again, 3 different ways to solve quadratics. One is by factoring, okay, and that's where we use our x, right? We talked about that. The second way is where you can pull out a GCF. So for instance, if I had, say, 3x squared minus 3x equals 0, I can pull out a 3x, and then an x minus 1 equals 0. And then my two answers for here would be 0, and then this one would be positive 1. So then my answers for this one would be 1 and 0. Okay, so that's the GCF. The third way is the quadratic formula. I'm just going to write quad form. So the quadratic formula, remember that's negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. We can use it that way as well. There's also actually there's 4 ways. There's another way. It's solving by square roots. We haven't really done much with that, but it was kind of we've embedded it into some of the problems. So some of these particular problems are going to be able to do solving by square roots, or number 3, the quadratic formula. GCF and factoring are not necessarily going to come into play on these particular problems because the numbers are not always going to be very nice. So 1 and 2 really work when numbers are nice. 4 works when the number's a perfect square, and then 3 works for all. So let's get started with this problem on the board. So the question says you want to build a fence around a square garden that covers 1,369 square feet. How many feet of fence will complete the job? So a couple things. A square garden, okay, and it talks about covers this, okay, that means that it's area, okay, so it's a square garden that covers that much area. Well, the area of a square, if we remember, okay, is base times height, or it's really just base times base, because in a square the base and the height are the exact same thing, so you get b squared. And the formula that you'll probably use and see in geometry is not necessarily a b squared, it's probably going to use an s squared for side squared. Okay, I'm just telling you that because a square is the same as a rectangle, it's the same formula. Just because it looks different doesn't mean the formula changes. So it's base times height, which is really base times base, right? And then b squared, or really s squared, is what you're actually going to probably see. So if I know the area, again, of a square is equal to s squared, I know that the area is 1,369 equals s squared. This is where that 4th way of solving quadratics comes into play. Because I isolated the square here, I can actually take the square root of s and 1,369 to see what I get. So the square root of s squared is s. Remember, whenever I square root a square, I get just one of them that pops out. So it's just s to the first power, right? It's not 2, it's just one of them, so it's s to the first. And then I have to square root 1,369. So when I square root 1,369, I get 37. So that's the length of a side. Now let's draw a picture, or we could have drawn a picture before, let's draw one now. So if I have a square garden and I want to draw a picture, this 37, 37, 37, and 37, right? It's a square, so every side has to be the same. Now the question actually says, how many feet of fence will complete the job? Well, what does that mean? That means we're finding perimeter. So perimeter is taking the sides and adding them all up. So 37 plus 37 plus 37 plus 37, or 37 times 4, right? The amount of sides. So 37 times 4 is 148. Yay, my answer. No, that is not your answer. The reason why it's not your answer is because how many feet? Oh, 148 feet. Oh, okay. That's how much feet of fence I will need to complete the job for this particular example. All right, this next problem, you notice it's a bit more wordier, and we now actually have an equation that's given to us. It's talking about motion of projectiles, and if you've ever taken physics, that equation will kind of look very familiar. And so what I want to do is, it's a projectile that's fired up at an initial velocity of 120 feet per second from the top of a 32-foot building. And there's the formula right there, the equation, where h is the height in feet and t is the time in seconds. So the question now says, after how many seconds does the projectile hit the ground? Give your answer as a decimal rounded to the nearest hundredth. Okay, what that means is I want to find a decimal value. Okay, this is a real world problem. I'm not saying you're going to go out and calculate motion of a projectile, you know, off of a building or whatever, but because it's a real world problem, you want to find a decimal value. You don't want to tell somebody the answer is -3 plus or minus 2 root 3 over 10. They're going to look at you with a blank stare and think you're crazy. Okay, I want to give them a decimal. So 3.7. Oh, that looks a little bit better. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, let's write the equation down. So h equals -16t squared plus 120t plus 32. Well, it says when the projectile hits the ground. When it hits the ground, what is the height of the projectile? It tells you right here h is 0. Now, it's not always going to tell you, but you have to understand what that means. When a projectile hits the ground, okay, it's going to hit 0. Now, what does the graph of this actually look like? Okay, so here's your graph, your xy coordinate plane. And if I'm on top of a building, so I'm up here, right, 32, and I'm firing something up, and then it's got to come down, right? It hopefully comes down. If it doesn't, then gravity doesn't play a big part in this stuff. So when it hits the ground right in there. What's the value of the height? How tall is it? Or how much is it off the ground? It's not off the ground, it's 0, it's on the ground. So that is why my h value is 0. So now because I have this side to be 0, I want to solve my equation for the variable t. How do I do that? Well, here's how I would get it done pretty quick. You can try to factor all you want, but you're going to get some ridiculously big number up here. This number is going to be 120, and you have to try to find two numbers that go there. I'm going to tell you that's not a very good way of doing it because the numbers are going to be very large. I will tell you that the best way to probably solve this one and every subsequent problem is to try to use the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula, remember this is A, B, and C. And now let's plug in. -120, remember the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of 120 squared minus 4 times a times c over 2 times a. All right, that looks okay. I mean, we've done this before. It looks pretty good. So now let's keep going. -120 plus or minus the square root of 120 squared is 14,400. Okay, 14,400. Plus, why is it a plus? Because I have two negatives, -4, -16. So 4 times 16 times 32 gives me 2,048. So plus 2,048 over -32. Okay, I'm going to kind of erase the graph a little bit so kind of have a little more room to work here. So I get -120 plus or minus the square root. Now let's add 14,400 to 2,048, and I get 16,448 over -32. Now, there's a couple different ways of doing this. Okay, one is just plug it in a calculator and figure it out. The other way is to do it kind of individually, and I wouldn't recommend that, because what's going to happen is when you square root 16,448, you get 128.249756335, or whatever your calculator will say up to a certain point. And that's not very good. Okay, you don't want to leave that. So if you were able to just type it into your calculator, make sure you use parentheses the right way, and I'll kind of show you a little bit how to do that, then you should be good to go with your values. So what you're going to do is, because I have a plus and a minus right here, you're going to choose, say, the plus to start with. So in your calculator, what you're going to do is this. So here's how. I take the negative 120, I take the plus sign, I'm going to open up a square root. When I open up a square root, most calculators will make a parentheses there. That parentheses is for the number that's inside the square root, which is 16,448. Then I have to close the set of parentheses. So now this here is just the numerator above your fraction. Once you type that in, you're going to hit enter. That's going to give you some number like 8.249 and so on. Then I still have to divide by negative 32. Once you hit enter, you're going to hit the divide sign by negative 32 and then enter again. And that's going to give you some value that is negative 0.25. Okay, so that's one of our answers. Okay, so that's one. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go back up to this point here, whether you have to retype it or you can kind of just, I don't know, go up and change the sign. You're going to change this plus sign to a negative, to a minus sign. So it's negative 120 minus the square root, open parentheses, 16448, close, enter. Then whatever you get, you're going to hit divide by negative 32, and you're going to get some other value. And you're going to get 7.757, 804,88547. But, so let me rewrite that. Let me just write that down here real quick. So 7.7578048 and so on. But the question says round to the nearest hundredth. That's the second place. So that right there is the hundredth. So I got to round it, so it's 7.76. 7.76. So your two answers are 7.76 and negative 0.25. Some of you might be like, those are my answers. And to those people, I would say, nah, that's not right. The reason why is this. What does those actual values represent? The 7.76 represents time. The negative 0.25 represents time. Can I have negative time? I cannot. If I did, that would be awesome, but I cannot. So therefore, this negative 0.25 is not an answer. The negative numbers, when we talk about time, automatically get thrown in the trash. We forget about them. So our answer is 7.76. And what are our units? They are in seconds. If you want to abbreviate seconds as SEC, you are 100% okay with that. Now, for some of you with calculators that don't put parentheses when you open up a square root, yours, for the most part, will probably give you a square root, and you're allowed to type inside it. And that's okay. Then do it exactly like you appear. If you have a calculator that doesn't do that, like one of the basic TI-30, say XAs or something like that, then you're going to have to do the square root first. It's like they take the plus the square root and then subtract the 120 and then divide. You're going to have to do the square root first. It's not going to like it if you don't do that. You might be able to find another way to do it. I strongly recommend trying to get a different calculator if you have one of those basic TI-30s. This concludes the solving a quadratic equation from a word problem. Okay, remember we talked about quadratic formula with the negative b, plus or minus, all that stuff. And then also potentially by taking the square root with those perimeter problems in the area.